So this happened to me around 6 months ago. I have lived where I've lived for 3 years now, and it's a nice apartment in an amazing location, but they were built in the late 90s. The last few years, the city I live in has had a massive population boom, and people have been non-stop pouring in. Good weather, amazing economy, cool place to do stuff always. And because of this, I've seen the landlord's staff start to do heavy maintenance on the apartments to bring them up to date to attract more people to them. My neighbor lived in his apartment for something like 6 years before he ended up buying a house and moved. When he moved, the landlord started immediately redoing his apartment as one to bring it up to date. The way that the apartment layout is that there are 2 stories. Where my bedroom is, on the direct other side of the bedroom wall, is the staircase in my neighbor's apartment. The way my bedroom layout is that it has my bed right up against that wall. So, they were completely stripping this place clean. It was one of the first ones that they did such heavy remodeling to, and for weeks I would always see the workers over there painting and redoing the floors, etc. A few days before this happened, it was no different. I left and saw them doing their maintenance on the kitchen, and when I came home from work, they were gone for the day. Nothing unusual. But the part that is unusual is what happened one particular night. So I was awake around 1 a.m. just watching TV in my room when I heard someone on the other side of the wall slowly walking up the stairs, and very obviously stopping halfway up. Where the person was stopping was directly where my head laid on the other side of the wall, and I could feel him listening to me breathing. I immediately turned the TV sound off and sat there extremely quiet and still. I heard nothing for a few minutes, and then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the person start walking the rest of the stairs to the second floor. My survival instinct kicked in instantly. It was very obvious that someone was on the other side of that wall listening to me. I also knew that it was only a few days before this happened that I saw the maintenance redoing that apartment's kitchen. I knew that there was no way that someone already moved in that fast. I quietly got out of bed and went to a room where I had a better view of the outside of the apartment. I obviously couldn't see if there was movement in there from the window, but I had a good angle to see if anyone walked out. So I sat there for about 15 minutes just staring outside to see if I saw anything at all, and nothing. I went back into my room and I laid down in bed again. I didn't play the TV this time though, I just kind of sat there waiting to hear something again. I was messing around on my phone for about 20 minutes in silence until I heard movement in the stairs again. This time, though, the movement didn't start from the top or the bottom. The movement started in the middle of the staircase, meaning that the entire time that I was sitting there in silence, this person was just on the other side of the wall listening to my every move. This terrified me, so I called the cops at this point. I gave them all the information of what was going on, and they informed me that someone would be out very soon. I went back to the one room and watched out the window again. Only a few moments later, a police car pulled up and a cop got out to examine the building and the apartment. He was looking around and shining his light in the windows, and I heard him knock on the door and shortly after could hear him talking to someone, but couldn't make out what they were saying. I was totally puzzled by this, and the officer walked over to my door and knocked. I went downstairs and he informed me very nicely that someone just moved in there. I laughed and I was completely embarrassed. I even said to the cop that it was a hell of a way to meet your new neighbor. I felt embarrassed, but more importantly, very relieved about the entire situation. So I brushed off the whole thing as it just being late and my mind playing massive tricks on me. The next day I went to leave my apartment when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. I went outside and only took a few steps towards my car when I saw a maintenance over there carrying out the old refrigerator. I was puzzled at this point, so I walked over to the apartment and I looked into the door that was wide open. And the kitchen was still being worked on, and not a single piece of furniture could be seen. I was legitimately speechless, and I walked over to the maintenance man and said, "Did someone move in here?" And he informed me that no, and that the apartment wouldn't be ready for showings until at least 3 weeks. At this point, I ran back upstairs into my apartment and I called my landlord. I asked her if someone is staying there, and she said absolutely not. I told her about what I experienced the night before, and she was floored. She told me that they would change that apartment's lock immediately, and she also suggested that I call the non-emergency line to the police department and inform them that no one lives there. I did just that, and they asked me to come down to the station, and I told them all of the information in detail about what happened. They were able to quickly figure out what officer came out to check out the situation so he could help identify the person who answered the door. The officer described the man in detail, and I confirmed that I had never seen him around the apartments before. But there was a search around town for a few weeks until the whole thing just sort of fizzled out, and I stopped hearing about it and started seeing less and less patrol cars randomly in the parking lot. After that night, I never heard another thing in that apartment as well. Around a month later, an older couple moved in and they were really nice. But when I saw the moving van pull up, I went out to introduce myself to them, but to be completely honest, the only reason I went out there was to see if any of them matched the description of who the cops saw. And it wasn't even close. I'm certain now that the person who was in the apartment, they got away with it. I had an extremely hard time sleeping the following weeks after that happened to me, and I actually ended up moving my bed into the smaller second bedroom because it bothered me so much. I have zero idea of what the intentions of the person was or what he was doing in that staircase, but it's easily one of the most chilling things that's ever happened to me. I was just commenting somewhere else about how a teacher in one of my high schools was arrested for placing nipple clamps on a male student. I tried to look up the article and found out that upwards of 6 to 7 teachers, male and female, during my time there had been arrested for all sorts of abuse. Most after I graduated though, but one in particular made me just shake my head. So, I had a woodshop teacher that went out of his way to be the cool guy. He would let us pretty much do anything in class and would even let us go out of the side door and smoke if we wanted, and he would also come up to us guys and make really sexual comments about female students. But one time I remember him coming over to me and some other dudes with an open can of shellac, it's white and sticky, and saying, "Hey fellas, you know you got yourself a good whore when she takes a load like this." He then laughed and looked at a really attractive girl in class and said, "Bet she does." We all kind of just nervously chuckled and let out a big "what the F" after he walked away. Years after I graduated, I actually worked with him for a short time and he was still creepy as ever. And I just found an article saying that he was arrested last year for inappropriately touching 3 female students and providing male students with drugs and alcohol. Other gems from this school include the aforementioned nipple clamp story, a female teacher abusing 2 male students, and pretty much the whole coaching staff for football being removed for allowing players to sexually abuse other players and hazing rituals, and the really sick part with the last one is that the parents of the community were enraged at the victims of the abuse, and the school for removing the coaches and punishing the players. Why? Because the school was winning a ton of championships and these scumbag parents thought that that was more important than the safety of their own children. What the hell is going on in this school? It's always creepy when someone you've known forever and have thought of like a mentor is revealed to just be something much, much different. So, I had this boss who I'll call Mike, and he had come to fill in for a few months while my regular boss was on maternity leave. He was pretty amazing, and he inspired me to work harder and even ended up promoting me. The 2 of us and a 3rd employee, I'll call James, were always working shifts together. It was fun, just laughing and kicking ass because we all had a similar sense of humor, and James and I were definitely the best employees there. After Mike's time to fill in was over, James and I were super bummed about it because he was seriously the best manager that we'd ever had. He was fair and rewarded hard work and truly cared about his employee satisfaction. Plus, he just made everything fun, even though we were working really hard. We both looked up to Mike as a manager and also just as a human being. We had the utmost respect for him and we vowed to keep in touch when we parted ways. Well, fast forward a year or so and James and I ended up dating. We kept in touch with Mike and he was so happy that we ended up together because he thought that we were both great people who deserved each other. We saw Mike a few more times and kept in touch over the years through social media. When James proposed and we started planning our wedding, we knew we wanted Mike to be in it. He was part of our trio back before James and I even knew that we would be together, and the three of us had a really strong bond. So we asked him if he would be okay with reading something during the ceremony, and he accepted, expressing how honored he felt. Well, when it got to the day of the wedding, Mike was nowhere to be seen. We kept calling him as the ceremony was quickly approaching, and finally James got a hold of him. Mike told him that he couldn't get out of work and wouldn't be able to make it. We were both taken aback a little because the Mike that we knew and looked up to would never bail like this and not even let us know. We figured that there had to be some sort of reasonable explanation, but were pretty disappointed, but the wedding had to go on. We had James's niece to do the reading, even though Mike's name was printed in the program, and, well, fast forward again a few more years. We had only spoken to Mike a handful of times since the wedding, but he had also taken the time to write me a beautiful, lengthy recommendation letter in that time period. There were no hard feelings about the wedding, and James and I still shared the highest of opinions of our friend. Then, Mike just kind of disappeared off of all social media, and the next time we tried calling him, his phone number had changed. James and I exchanged sentiments of concern and hoped that he was doing okay, but I didn't go much past that. One day, James got a random call from a number that wasn't in his contact list. He answered it, and it turned out to be Mike, so he put him on speakerphone so I could say hello too. We had our brief pleasantries, but then Mike got into the reason for his call. He wanted to know if he could stay with us for a day or two. My initial reaction was, of course, but James shot me a sharp look, so I added, well, let us discuss it and we'll call you back. Before concluding the call, James inquired about what was going on. Mike said that he'd been living with his father to take care of him because he was terminally ill, but that he couldn't stay there another night because he checked the camera footage in their home and seen his dad on the tape standing over him with a knife while he slept. When the call was ended, James said that he thought something was off. I didn't really get why he'd instantly be that suspicious. I mean, the story was insane and all, but it was Mike. James said something like, we haven't heard from him in forever and now he's calling us for a favor. He lives 2 hours away and we're the ones he calls. Why wouldn't he seek the help of someone closer? I mean, he has family in the area too. I agreed that it was odd, and it definitely conjured up a lot of questions, including why there were even cameras inside of their house in the first place, but I still didn't like the idea of leaving Mike hanging if he truly was out of options. I told James that we should call back and probe a little more. When we called back, James asked if it wouldn't be easier to have someone closer to help him out, and asked about family in the area. Mike gave a vague explanation of why everyone in his life had turned against him. Then, with the most mopey, disappointed voice, he said it was okay if we couldn't help, that he understood what was going on and wouldn't bother us anymore. And James and I looked at each other and said, we'll call him right back. We quickly discussed that this was all very strange, but that he had to be pretty desperate to contact us for help. We acknowledged that his little bit about understanding if we were unable to help was meant to manipulate us, and we felt conflicted about everything, but ultimately decided a few days couldn't hurt. We called him back, told him that he could come, and figured that we give him the address and that would be that. But he said that he no longer had a vehicle and would need to be picked up. We asked about catching an Uber, and he said that he had no money that he could access at that moment, which we didn't pry him on. It was getting late, and it was a long drive to his location, so we asked if he had anywhere to stay for that night, and we could try the trip in the morning. He said that he'd just sleep on a park bench or something, which, again, we knew was meant to manipulate us, but we didn't cave in on that one. We asked where we should pick him up the following day, and he gave us his dad's address. Immediately after we got off the phone, we were like, what the heck has been going on with Mike that has ostracized him from all his friends and family and caused him to lose his car? He had been making 4 times our salary when we all first met and had a brand new car, and now he didn't even have money for an Uber? Well, we went and picked him up the next day, and I got out and ran up and gave him a hug. He seemed oddly unresponsive to my affection, so I just shrugged it off and showed him to the front passenger seat where I'd been sitting. He was super tall, so I let him sit up there and I hopped in the back. When we got back to our house, we showed him our guest room and put his things down, and then immediately asked if we could take him to the grocery store. James said that he was done driving for the day, so I said I'd take him, but commented that I thought that he didn't have money on him. He told me that he had food stamps, which there's no way that he would have qualified for with his old job. So at this point, I knew something was up, but I wasn't going to dig into the personal details of his finances, so I just logged it into the back of my mind and kept my mouth shut. You might be thinking that it just sounds like someone who's fell on hard times, and that was basically Mike's story as well, but it was just very vague in important areas and full of story after story about people that seemed determined to destroy him for no reason whatsoever. Well, 1 or 2 bad eggs is believable, I suppose, but no one is the innocent victim in every scenario, right? He was telling us that he had no idea why his life had fallen apart and why those close to him seemed to just turn on him out of nowhere, or why so many people were out to get him without seeming having any motivation. And well, 2 nights turned into a full week, and finally James asked Mike what his plan was. Mike acted hurt and said that he'd be gone by the morning, and we told him that he didn't need to leave immediately, but we'd like to have some kind of idea of his plan for going forward. That night in bed, James and I discussed it and decided that we'd tell Mike that he could stay for as long as he needed if he wanted to help out around the house and keep his room relatively clean because it contained several antique items of James's mother's. We also were going to ask him to help me with some entrepreneurial decisions, as Mike had claimed to have been a totally self-made successful entrepreneur before this. We presented our offer the next day, and Mike excitedly accepted. We thought that it was going to be a rewarding trade-off for all parties, in fact. Now, this isn't a story about my marriage, so I'm not going to go too far into the wealth of the problems James and I had, but a little info will be necessary. So James was highly critical of me and often talked down to me and seemed to have nothing but negative opinions. I wasn't perfect, I admit, but I wanted to be loved and worked my ass off for James's approval. I was constantly trying to make him happy, but no matter what I did, I would always fail in his eyes. So, after a few weeks, Mike clearly started to see the cracks in the marriage, despite the fact that James toned it down in Mike's presence. Trying to be a good wife, I acted like all was fine in front of Mike and never mentioned any dissatisfaction in my marriage. Mike and I started to spend a lot of time alone in our entrepreneurial pursuits, and he was supposed to be teaching me the tricks of the trade with several avenues of making money, but we just kept coming out with little success. He had excuses and explanations for why this wisdom didn't seem to be progressing us forward at all, but he was someone that I greatly looked up to as a professional and a friend, so I just believed that it would all pay off soon, like he said. After living together for weeks, enough talking among all of us had been done to start noticing weird contradictions to many of the things Mike had told us, but he always worded things in a way that left a slight amount of room for doubt so that if you were to question any of it, there was wiggle room. There was never a way to straight up catch him in a lie is what I'm getting at. Mike also wasn't fulfilling his end of our deal at home and kept saying that he'd take his turn to do the dishes and such, but I probably only did it once or twice, I'd say, and he completely trashed the guest room. And not only was there garbage everywhere, but he'd bring in food and drinks and they'd be lost in this sea of clothes and trash, and we could smell things rotting in there. But there was a melted tub of ice cream just sitting on the bedside table for weeks, and I didn't care as much as James did, and I suggested that we just remove his mum's things from the room, but I did agree that it was disrespectful. Meanwhile, things were getting more and more icy with James and I, and one day when I was out with Mike on a job, I broke down in tears about how much I was hurting about how James treated me. Mike offered words of comfort and reluctantly admitted that he'd picked up on how mean James could be to me and said that he was really sorry and that I didn't deserve it. Mike, having been possibly the only witness that I ever had to what I'd been going through in my marriage, he was amazingly validating. Mike agreed that it was incredibly unjustified, but made me promise not to tell James that he'd said anything because he didn't want to appear like he was taking sides. The next day, Mike had once again volunteered to take a turn doing the dishes, so I didn't do them. I hated doing dishes and happily left them for Mike when he assured me that he'd handle it. Well, Mike got a call informing him that his dad didn't have long to live, so he wanted to go see him. James didn't seem all that interested in helping, so I volunteered to take him and stay for moral support, and we headed out. On the way to see his dad, Mike started to tell me that his dad has dementia and makes up weird things, so he advised me not to take anything to heart. He cited a few examples of things that he'd previously said, and they were all more like accusations. One of them being that Mike had stolen all the money in his savings, which I thought was pretty odd, but couldn't really reconcile the vast differences between the Mike that I'd met 8 years before and someone who could rob his dying father. While we were visiting his dad, I didn't say much, as I didn't want to insert myself into a private family moment, but I kept noticing things that were just weird. Like that his dad was fully conscious and talkative and didn't seem like a dying man at all. He even asked him to get him some Burger King in the middle of it all. I kept trying to justify things in my head, like, who am I to say a dying man can't want a final meal at a Burger King? A few hours in, and James called, irate that I had left again without doing the dishes that Mike promised to do. He chewed me out and threatened divorce, which was always his go-to to try to whip me into shape. And having the recent affirmation from Mike that I wasn't the only one who saw James' emotional abuse, I said, fine, divorce won't be thrown in my face anymore, so divorce it is. Back in Mike's dad's room, his dad was yelling about his will and money and such, and Mike looked at me in a way to signal that the dementia was talking. I had started to really question what happened with his dad and if he was really even dying at all, but it wasn't something that I could really handle or investigate at that moment, given that I'd just separated from my husband. When we left the hospital, Mike's dad was still alive and, in fact, eating candy bars. I had nowhere else to go, so I went back home and just slept upstairs on the couch. I didn't speak to James for 2 whole days, and then Mike said that he'd talk to his mum and I could stay there for a week. I wondered at that moment why his mum wasn't the one helping him if they were in contact and on good terms, but I just accepted the offer. I couldn't take being at that house anymore, and Mike said that he was going to go with me and stay there too, which I thought looked really bad, but he said that he spoke to James and that he understood and was fine with it. I spent the entire week crying and talking to Mike about how I felt, and he even woke up in the middle of the night with me if I woke up, and things started spiraling downhill quickly. He made no advances on me or anything of the sort, but it was definitely weird. After the week, I went to stay with my parents, and Mike went back to stay with James, and I eventually saw them both when I'd come over to get things, and in talking with James, he was very much ready for Mike to leave. They barely seemed to talk, in fact, and did not seem on good terms whatsoever. And then, one night, I just got the weirdest impulse to ask James if Mike ever said anything about me that he made him promise not to tell me. James hesitated for a second, but said yes. And through a series of questions, we inched through both of our experiences with Mike. And he had been playing into our rapidly declining marriage and was using everything he observed against us. He'd been going out and teaching me things to make money, and he did the same thing he did as my boss all those years before, told me my strengths and complimented my ability to catch on to things quickly. We didn't have much success, but it was very obviously not on account of me. However, he was going back and feeding into James's terrible opinion of me and claiming that we weren't making any money because I was so dense and hard to teach. Mike would also comment on the very same things that he told me were unacceptable that James did, except he'd tell James that he doesn't know how he lives with someone like me and that he'd go insane. In other words, this guy was carefully and strategically forcing our marriage to fall apart by exacerbating our personal fears and insecurities and systematically validating and encouraging our resentment for one another. And he did it in such a way that neither of us doubted his sincerity for a moment, until I finally just got a weird feeling and decided to ask that night. And even then, I didn't really anticipate finding out that he'd been so two-faced and manipulative to that extreme level. James kicked him out that night, and neither of us have talked to him again since, as far as I know anyway. I haven't spoken to James in 1.5 years, and I proceeded with the divorce despite this because even though Mike was an insincere piece of crap, he caused me to get enough distance from James that I was able to see that I deserved a lot better. Last I heard about Mike was from his mum, who called me to see why he'd been asked to abruptly leave James's house. I told her what he'd done, and she didn't seem surprised. I asked if she was aware of any mental problems that he may have had, and she said that she didn't want to betray her son by giving details, but that he wasn't right in the head. I asked about several of the traumatic events Mike had claimed to be the victim of, and she said that there's never been evidence that any of it really happened. I don't know why he actively initiated the final downfall of my marriage, because I've never felt it was an attempt to be with me or anything. I really don't get what his motivation or game would have been. And then, Mike's mum texted me a few days after he left James's house to tell me that he'd apparently been admitted into a psychiatric facility and wouldn't be out for a long time. And she wouldn't elaborate.